welcome you to the Ripon Church of Christ. I know there's a few faces that I have not seen before or met before, and we are so happy you are here as our guest today, and we hope that you will keep coming back to worship the Lord with us. Your presence here today lifts us up, and we're so happy that you're here with us today. You know, God has instilled in man the inclination to worship. Eternity has been instilled on our hearts, in our souls. Today we're going to look at God's perspective on life through the preacher Solomon. Solomon, the wise preacher who wrote the book of Ecclesiastes, and he's writing a great sermon in this book. In fact, Ecclesiastes means preacher, which derives from the Greek word ekklesia, which we know means the called out congregation or the assembly. Solomon here, he's not trying to be a king, but a preacher, verse 1. Good preachers are not going to focus on their credentials, but they're going to focus on speaking forth the Word of God. However, when one reads this book, they may get a sense of lost hope, a sense of worthlessness. Basically, it may make them want to hide under a rock and die, so to speak. Now, to believe so, they are missing the point. When we live life under the Son, that is under Jesus, rather than all of the things under heaven, that is the everyday life here on this earth, the things that are eventually going to fade away. We live lives that are meaningful and purposeful for God right now. Yes, a life lived without the Lord has no lasting value. See, we must have a foundation set in our lives that carries eternal value. When we look at our lives and we look at work and we look at pleasure and relationships, friendships, hobbies, and the list goes on and on. See, those things are meaningless. Things are mundane on our own. So Psalm brings our attention to, without God, there is no advantage. Look at verse 2 of Ecclesiastes. Solomon writes, "Vanity of vanities. Vanity of vanities, all is vanity." See, Solomon here, he's not coming from the perspective of living life that one who follows God. The perspective is coming from a position of life lived without God. See, when we look at that word vanity, and he repeats it 3 times here, he's showing that he really wants to drive that point across. He wants the reader to dial in on what he is preaching in this sermon. The Hebrew word for vanity, it's also translated futility. Used in its context here in Ecclesiastes is lack of real value, hollowness, worthlessness. When it's in its basic form, it means breath, or it means vapor, mist, or even smoke. When it's applied to objects or activities, it means worthless. It means empty. It means valueless. Now, when it's applied to a person, it refers to the emptiness or the futility of that individual's life. So overall, vanity means a life without God has no redeeming or lasting value. So Solomon's going to ask the question here in verse 3. In verse 3 he says, "What advantage does man have in all his work which he does under the sun?" When you look at that word, Hebrew word for advantage, it's also here in other parts of Ecclesiastes meaning excels or meaning profits. Basically like a financial ledger with a profit-loss statement. Also, commercial term meaning success over failure. Jesus said this in Matthew chapter 16, verse 26. He says, "For what will it profit a man If he gains the whole world, it forfeits his soul. Or what will a man give in exchange for his soul? See, Jesus teaches if a man has everything, basically he has the whole world, so to speak, but he loses his own soul, then he has nothing. See, in life, people strive to gain advantage, don't they? When we look in the business world, the businessmen and women, they look for an advantage. Let's say in negotiation, to close the deal more in their favor. Or we could look at the world of sports. An athlete looks to gain advantage. He does that in baseball. He does that in football. He does that in NASCAR. In football, it is said that the 12th man meaning the home team's fans, give the team an advantage. The Seattle Seahawks Stadium, as you see up here on the screen, they say that when they built that stadium, they built it so it would be the noisiest stadium in the NFL. I mean, the noise would be deafening. So the quarterbacks from the opposing team couldn't even hear. They would try to yell out the count, and the center couldn't hear, and the receivers couldn't hear, and it messes up the whole offense. And if they're any good, if they have a good defense, if they have a good team, they have that 12th man to help them. Seattle had this back in their winning days and winning the Super Bowl. That 12th man. You know, in the 1993 movie, I don't know if you've seen it, but Groundhog Day, and starring Bill Murray, and he's a weatherman out of Pittsburgh, and he plays a character of Phil Connors, and he's sent to a small town there, Punxsutawney, to report on the famous groundhog, Punxsutawney Phil, who is actually, this is the real thing. And the movie's called Groundhog Day, and Phil Connors, he's arrogant, he's sarcastic, but he has a rude awakening. See, he wakes up every morning reliving the same day, February 2nd. He relives that Groundhog Day. And he is in his monotonous misery every day. He lives this life where he decides, you know, he's going to go break the law, and he's going to do other things that aren't very good for himself, even hurting, or, you know, things that are destructive to his life. Because he knows that he's going to wake that same day, the next day. But he then realizes he could take advantage of this. You know, he could have short-term solutions, and he could look for material things and pleasures of the world. He could predict things to impress the ladies. Especially, he looks to impress his producer, Rita, played by Andy McDowell. See, Phil Connors in this movie, he found his monotonous life. It's boring, it's unchanging, it's wearisome. And he basically is never satisfied. See, that is our life without God. Monotonous, boring, unchanging, wearisome. See, our labors here on earth mean nothing without God. The very gains that we receive from the hard labor that we live in our life, eventually they're going to be negated by death one day. It is absurd to believe that we're going to take anything with us. We've heard of that saying, that we came into this world with nothing, and we're going to go out of this world with nothing. Solomon states that all things are meaningless, verse 2. All things are wearisome, in verse 8. There is nothing new under the sun, verse 9. What is crooked cannot be strengthened, verse 15. See, he's putting in our minds a world lived without God. See, these things are all true when God is absent in one's life. However, we could learn some lessons from Solomon in this passage. He teaches two great truths as we search for substance and meaning in our lives. So the first truth, there are a lot of things in this world that are no value. One in particular would be having our priorities out of place. Denny Petrillo wrote this: our priorities can get out of balance. We major in minors. We strain out a gnat and swallow a camel, Matthew chapter 23, verse 24. How hard is it for men to discover what is really important? Lifetimes have been spent in building empires, amassing great fortunes, and receiving the praise of men. Vanity, Solomon replied. In effect, it is all vanity. Why? Is all that hard work not worth something? Does accumulated wealth is not a testimony to one's greatness? No, said the preacher. These are merely examples of misplaced priorities. And how true is that? Now, of course, this does not mean that hard work is meaningless and valueless. This does not mean that one who has money, who has that type of success, who has built a business, who has built a company, he employs others, and he offers a wonderful service or a wonderful product. It does not mean that is meaningless and valueless. It's simply when it is not done for God, when it's not done for the glory of God, when we strive after such materialism in this world, that materialism to benefit me, then basically he says we are striving after the wind, verse 14. Our priorities must be in line with God's perspective on what life is and what life should be. Now look at the second truth. The second truth is God is the only one who determines and defines what true value is. We can say, what is valuable to God? Well, you are. Your soul is valuable to God. When we look at our lives, our soul should be the most important thing in our lives as we live this life every day. We serve an eternal God. We serve a God who has always been. We serve a God who is all-knowing. He sees everything. He knows everything. God could look into our lives and He knows the exact things that are going to take our focus off of Him. He knows when we put our trust in material things, those things of this world. He knows those things that aren't going to accomplish His will. He knows that those are things that are stumbling blocks and distractions to keep us from reaching our eternal home. Yes, God knows that. And God cares about us. He loves us. He wants our eternal soul to be saved, to be with Him in heaven. Can we determine the vain from the valuable all on our own? Or according to Solomon, we cannot. See, we need godly guidance in our lives. When we strive for that eternal every day, then we could say we have everything, don't we? See, life lived for the Lord will not leave us longing for the futile things of this life. Yes, in life there is no advantage without God. Solomon now, he's going to go into these illustrations from the world to prove his thesis of all things being vanity. And he first uses the standpoint of the endless cycles of nature. Solomon gives 4 proofs from the standpoint of nature. See, nature shows many cycles, and they are repetitious, and they are mundane, like Groundhog Day for Phil Connors in that movie. Look at verses 4 through 7. He says, a generation goes and a generation comes, but the earth remains forever. Also the sun rises and the sun sets, and hastening to its place, it rises there again, blowing toward the south and turning toward the north. The wind continues swirling along, and on its circular courses the wind returns. All the rivers flow into the sea, yet the sea is not full. To the place where the rivers flow, there they flow again. So let's look at these 4 proofs from nature that all is vanity. He's going to start with the earth. See, when we look at the earth, and the earth is permanent, and the earth is steady. And permanent, I mean not forever. It's not eternal. When God says that's time, when He says it's done, we know what He's going to do with that earth, with this earth. When we look at us, people are born every day and we die every day. You know, people do that. Every day someone's born. Every day someone dies. That's been happening since the very creation. But the earth keeps going. The earth endures. And it's ironic that the earth was created for man, yet men come and go, and the earth remains. Jerome wrote this. He wrote, "What is more a vanity of vanities than the fact that the earth endures? Although it was made for the benefit of man, while man himself, the master of the earth, suddenly crumbles into dust." See, God knows the time in which He's going to call it quits for the earth, when He's going to bring that fire and He's going to burn the earth up. But for right now, the earth remains steady and constant. God knows that time. The real, and then the second proof is the sun. Another creation of the God. The sun aids in warming us. It aids in feeding us. It aids in helping us to sustain all life. But the sun operates repetitiously. Every day the sun rises, and then it hurries across the sky, and then it eventually sets. The psalmist wrote about this in Psalm chapter 19, verse 4 through 6. And then he uses the wind, the third proof. How the wind blows. It blows in a circular path. Science has determined that. We know the sun rises in the east and it sets in the west. Well, the wind blows from the south to the north, and we don't know why it does. But what we do know is the wind provides important benefits for us. But Solomon tells us the wind also is repetitious in its cycle. And then he talks about the rivers. Although there's so many rivers that flow into the seas, but the seas never overflow. An example, we could look at the Dead Sea. The River Jordan flows into the Dead Sea, and there's no outlet there. Yet the Dead Sea, it never fills up. It never overflows. Solomon knew of God's hydrological cycle. Dr. Henry Morris, in his book, The Remarkable Wisdom of God, stated this: the hydrological cycle is dependent on atmospheric circulation, Ecclesiastes 1, verse 6, as well as a circuit of the sun, 1:5. The sun evaporates water from the ocean, which is carried inland by the winds, where it can condense and fall onto the earth and then return to the ocean, page 184. So Solomon then is going to go into man. He's going to use 4 proofs from man that all is vanity with God in verses 8 through 11. First of all, he's going to say that people are never satisfied. Look at verse 8. He says, all things are wearisome. Man is not able to tell it. The eye is not satisfied with seeing, nor is the ear filled with hearing. Have you heard somebody ever say that if they just had more money, if they had just more money, if they made more money, then they could pay all their bills and they wouldn't have to struggle in life so much. But you think about mostly that people who make more money, those who aren't disciplined with their money, they're going to end up spending more. They're going to end up getting in more debt. They say that those who win the lottery, they end up being broke 3 to 5 years later. Some people continue to want more and more and more. I once knew this one man, this company, and ACN. I don't know if you ever heard ACN, and he was doing very well, very well. I mean, most of us would be like, wow, the money that him and his wife made. I mean, good people. I'm not putting him down, but he says, but you know what? I need to make at least $5 million more because I want to buy a jet. And I want to be able to fly my people here and here. Maybe the intentions were good, but see, what about when you make $5 million more? You going to be satisfied with $10 million? There's just people that aren't satisfied out there. Some of the biggest complainers are rich compared to most of the world when we look at the world. The strive to be satisfied, it's going to make people exhausted. It's going to make us weary if we're not careful. We saw that illustration earlier about Groundhog Day, that monotonous everyday waking and reliving that same life over and over that Phil Connors did. And then it drove him to destruction. It drove him to fleshly lust and gluttony, and it drove him to even robbery. And then it even drove him to suicide. Jumping off a roof, stepping in front of a car, taking a toaster into the bathtub. We think of that's terrible, and it is terrible. In a movie like that, it's funny because we know he's not really doing that. He's going to wake up the next day. But I cannot imagine that happening. I couldn't imagine just having a life that has no meaning, that is that type of monotonous every single day, of never being satisfied. See, never being satisfied in the futility of our ways is in which we go about seeing and we go about speaking and we hearing, and it's about the wisdom of God, the world, not the wisdom of God. We talked about that in James chapter 1, and we also have been going to be talking about that more in James chapter 3. Wisdom from the world can never deliver for us. It's never going to satisfy us. Only the godly wisdom, the wisdom we get from the Word, that's what's going to satisfy. Number 2, the second proof is people do not learn from history's lessons. Verse 9 says, what has been will be again. What has been done will be done again. There is nothing new under the sun. See, since the days of Solomon, there have been, I don't know how many, countless people who have been born over the thousands of years who have followed Solomon. And what has transpired in those years? Well, in our context here, nothing. Nothing learned. Those who do not learn from history, what does it say? They often will repeat it. That's right. There's nothing new under the sun, Solomon says. The same ignorance and futility that has been in the past is going to be repeated in each generation. And then number 3, people duplicate the discoveries already made. Verse 10. It says, is there anything of which one might say, see this, it is new? Already it has existed for ages which were before us. Now, of course, there are new inventions that happen over time. We know that. And many of them have advanced our lives. They've improved our lives in many ways. They've made our lives more convenient. They've saved us time. Solomon first alludes to that. But then Solomon is basically saying that we may come up with what we believe to be new. Right? We're going to believe it is new, but it really is not. Just new forms of such. Like there's new forms of travel. There's new forms of medicine. There's new forms of the weapons of warfare, and etc. See, we still face the same challenges of what former generations faced. Those things have not done anything about those. I mean, there's still that thrive to survive. There's still that drive for success. There's still that hope for happiness. And then number 4, people will be forgotten in time. Verse 11, it says, there is no remembrance of earlier things and also of the later things which will occur. There will be for them no remembrance among those who will come later still. See, when our generation is dead and gone, a new generation comes in. Will they know us? Do we know the generations from the past? See, nothing we do today will be able to show a generation in the future how great we were as people individually. Our value we have now is going to fade into history. But he's not talking about us as people and we can't do great things. Remember, we have to think about the perspective, what he's talking about, the perspective of a life lived without God. See, what has been done under the sun, S-U-N, all in which has been done under heaven, those things are vanity without God. Our lives need to be lived under the sun, under S-O-N, under Jesus. Life without Jesus is just vanity, Solomon tells us. It's just worthless. What is your life? How is your life being lived? Is your life being lived under the sun or under the Son? A life lived for Jesus is one that's lived for the everlasting. That we could take that, we could know, and when we live the life that Jesus wants us to live here, we know we have a home in heaven. It's a beautiful thing. And the lesson is yours today. Are you waiting for something to happen? Are you saying, I'll come to Jesus, if you haven't already, someday down the road? And God is saying, come now. Why would we wait? Why would we wait when salvation is right in front of our eyes? A lot of people wait and it's too late because we don't know what's going to happen in this life. We don't know if we're going to have 5 minutes from now. Paul talks about that. It says, today is the day to come to the Lord. If you haven't come to the Lord yet, you haven't obeyed Him, but you have been striving to do His will, you've been hearing enough, you've been studying about what you need to do not wait. As we sing this song in a few minutes, you could come forward. You could confess your faith in God. You can confess that Jesus is the Son of God. And you could be baptized, immersed in water today for the remission of your sins, like it says in Acts chapter 2, verse 38. Mark writes in Mark 16:16, he who believes and is baptized shall be. And we sing the invitation song.